Duluth has a brand new representative in St. Paul.
That's right. Minnesota House 8A was won last night by firefighter Pete Johnson. The DFLer beat former state trooper Mark McGrew by a wide margin. Now, Johnson spent 19 years with the fire department and 17 on the firefighters union executive board. This seat was vacant after longtime Rep. Liz Olson stepped down earlier this year.
And Northern News Now's Ryan Hayes caught up with Representative-elect earlier today.
From the firehouse to the Minnesota House, Pete Johnson is eager to represent West Duluth. The longtime firefighter says he knocked on over 6,000 doors to learn what matters most to Duluthians. He says during his time with the DFD, he saw a massive increase in emergency service calls. He says if more people had access to health care, housing, education, and good jobs, maybe that number could go down.
If we address some of those issues on the front end, less folks end up needing to call someone like me on the back end.
Some state house races appear to be headed toward automatic recount, but Johnson says there is a very real possibility that the balance of power ends up tied in the Minnesota House. Johnson says that could actually have a unifying impact on politics in the state.
It's going to force folks to work together and listen to one another to really get anything through.
Johnson started his campaign back in January when Representative Liz Olson announced that she would not be seeking re-election. He says Olson did a phenomenal job, was pragmatic and well-connected.
And if I could emulate that, I would be thrilled to be able to do it. She's leaving awful big shoes to fill.
Johnson hopes to find more common ground with Republicans on the issue of lead pipes in the city to get them removed quickly.
Ultimately, lead pipes for our drinking waters shouldn't be a partisan issue. So those are the types of issues that I think you should be able to find consensus and agreement on both sides of the aisles.
West Duluth's new state rep already looking ahead to his first days in office. In Duluth, I'm Ryan Hayes, Northern News Now.
As for Duluth's other state house race, Rep. Leash Kozlowski easily won 8B, which covers the east side of the city.